It's 1983, and the video games industry is dying. Some of the worst games of this era were being dropped, games which nobody liked, and ended up costing Atari over $500 million alone. With tons of competition at this time, none of it really stood out whatsoever. People were getting bored of video games. Retailers stopped wanting to carry these systems at all. This is the worst time to be a video games company. Sega was still in the game in Japan. There was nothing to look forward to in the West for years, but somehow, in 1985, entered Nintendo, with a console that saved the industry and allowed it to prosper into what we have today, the Nintendo Entertainment System, NES for short. The NES is a pretty large console, but not unreasonably so, and it looks like a VCR box, which allowed it to blend in with many of the VCRs released that year and prior, only retailing for $1.99. Well, this would normally be viewed as a bad thing because it becomes hard to tell it apart from many VCR products on the market. This was the smart thing to do because it allowed it to stand out from the competition. Considering that many people at this time wanted to stay away from game consoles, this allowed potential customers to give it a second look. That's why in the rest of the world, we got the NES, but in Japan, they had the family computer, or the Famicom, which looked much more playful, suitable as it was a gaming system, of course. The NES was a very simple device because it only played games, of course. On the front, you will find a power switch and a reset button, with 2 controller ports for multiplayer. On the right, you will find a video and mono audio port, or composite. Finally, on the back, you will find a white port that looks like the missing composite cable, but this was for the RF adapter needed for some TVs, an RF switch for switching between channel 3 and channel 4, and a power connector. As part of its design, the NES featured these ridges on top, which was entirely an aesthetic choice, from my understanding. Now, as for the actual controller for the NES, this controller was much simpler than other controllers we'd gotten with every other console beforehand, but it was the best one at the time. While the boxy and flat design of this controller doesn't lend too well to ergonomics in the long run, this is actually a fairly comfortable controller. And the buttons are pretty solid, with us only getting A, B, start, select, and this amazing D-pad. Nintendo was, without a doubt, at the top of D-pad makers because their D-pads were very simple, just 4 directions. But they feel great, and they are very, very precise. They kept a similar design for many years to come afterwards. Now let's talk about the cartridges. We have the cartridge slot, which opens with a quick lift from your finger. This is when we are introduced to our NES cartridges, which were very large, but at the time could fit, interestingly, anywhere between 24 kilobytes to 1 megabyte of data. This is obviously a huge gap in what any given cartridge can hold. So just slot these in and press downward to play your games. These cartridges were obviously iconic because they were unique. Only NES games looked this way, with many games from just about every other manufacturer looking almost identical. You knew exactly when you were buying a Nintendo game, and also showed because of the many IPs that Nintendo owned at this time and throughout the life of this console. Additionally, the cartridges, just as the Game Boy ones that we talked about before, came in essentially 2 varieties, the ones with the save battery and the ones, of course, without one. When you open these cartridges, you will also see that they are deceptively small, but the boards with the save battery also look a little bit different than those without. Essentially, this meant that games like Super Mario Bros. Simply did not have the ability to record your progress, since they didn't have a save battery. So every time you have to power this system on, you will have to replay the entire game. But with something like Final Fantasy, you had a save function to record your game saves, no problem, and they would actually stay. Granted, this cartridge system was not perfect by any means, because these would develop issues over time. If the 72-pin connector were too dirty, or if they were just broken at all, then you would be met by this flashing red light when you turn on the system. your system will most likely still play games, but it will give you lots of issues because of the poor connection. Games won't present correctly, missing colors, sound might not work either, etc. There are some workarounds such as not pressing the cartridge all the way down and letting it hang, or even blowing the cartridge to dust it off, which is actually not a great thing to do because you're just putting your spit in it and introduces corrosion. There have been many workarounds that are free, but they only work in the short term, and some people have had to replace their 72-pin connectors, which, while not difficult to do, still sucks to have to go through this at all. And a solution that has actually worked for me in the past, and of course in the present too, is just going to be to get some cotton swabs and some 99% isopropyl alcohol to begin wiping these down and cleaning the pins. Of course, I've tried doing this on the 72-pin, and I've also tried doing this on cartridges, and this has actually helped me in the past, at least I think so. However, there are going to be more effective ways of doing it, and I do think that replacing the 72-pin connector on the NES would actually be the better way to go if you want more stability, considering that they're more affordable. I will be leaving affiliate links in the description to 72-pin connectors that you can purchase for yours if you're not sure, and even cleaning kits that should be able to work just fine for you. But with the working NES, there was so much to play. Super Mario Bros., Donkey Kong, Dr. Mario, Duck Hunt, Zelda, Final Fantasy, etc. There were so many titles that gave us many more hours of fun and replayability than we have gotten before this. Now, obviously games like Super Mario Bros. Gave us a platformer with actual physics, where Mario would start off slowly and pick up speed after that initial start, even if the jumping itself still had a constant speed to it. People absolutely fell in love with Super Mario Bros., and we still see modern Mario games like this to this day. The original Legend of Zelda was another amazing game at that time, with an actual overworld to explore, and with its fast-paced, yet strategic combat, it sold incredibly well. Now, as a special note, while Final Fantasy was not the first JRPG released on a console, it was the one to really start popularizing JRPGs in North America. This game was very slow, of course, and it did lack a lot of the modern conveniences that make turn-based games, especially big ones like this one, actually fun for me, but this still was a big step in the right direction. To this day, I almost exclusively play JRPGs, so I'm glad Squaresoft were able to have such a complex game brought this early on to the most popular home console at the time. While Nintendo easily had the most popular games, some companies still attempted to compete, as gaming was being brought back to every family's living room once more. So Nintendo tried innovating in ridiculous ways at the time, but it really helped set them apart from the competition even more. For better or for worse. This was the era of Nintendo, when they were releasing a ton of different accessories for the NES. Some sold better than others, but this really was the time where we started to see how gimmicky Nintendo would get with its accessories now and in the future. Check this out. The NES had so many accessories released for it at the time, many of which are not that expensive today, such as the Max controller, which offered a better D-pad experience for fighting games, the Force Score for being able to play with 4 people instead of just 2, and even the Broderbund U-Force controller, which was a controller that responded to force from the palms of your hands. But on the pricier side, we got the Power Glove, which essentially gave you motion controls. So it would actually work by also attaching these sensors to your TV or putting them just around your TV, depending on what kind of TV you're using, and plugging right onto your NES. And then you can actually have motion controls for a variety of games. This even worked with Super Mario Bros. Of all things, which is hilarious to think about. And then we got R.O.B, which was an actual robot that you could hook up to your NES controller, then into the NES itself, and it literally played games for you. Now this little guy was way too slow to actually accomplish anything, and the novelty, I'm sure, wears off really quickly, but Nintendo was really trying their best to innovate in so many different ways. The only accessory I ended up getting for myself was the Zapper to play Duck Hunt with, and this was a very interesting gimmick that was so simple, and it was very easy to pick up and play with. Not to mention that this was always a very affordable accessory. Duck Hunt was designed to be played on a CRT, so it simply cannot be played on a modern TV. This is because of the way that CRT TVs work, as they have an electro gun inside of the TV, which lights the pixels on a TV screen in rows. The zapper itself looks for color references on your screen, and the screen flashes black when you pull the trigger, allowing the zapper to accurately detect whether you hit the duck inside of the smaller white box that would flash right after the black screen, before flashing in white to give the illusion of the duck actually getting shot. And it doesn't work with LCDs because of the picture processing done on the LCD screen, which causes a lot more lag between when you press the button on your zapper and when the TV displays what just happened. There's just too much processing going on in order for the gun and the TV to communicate properly with one another, which means that they just don't do anything with each other. But this was still very impressive and very fun. To this day, little gimmicks like this have aged really well, and if you have a CRT TV, then you will enjoy playing Duck Hunt just as intended. A lot of innovation took place in this time, and it persisted until 1991, when Nintendo had other plans in mind for the next generation of gaming. But by the end of the NES's life cycle, as it got discontinued in 1996, it managed to sell 61.91 million units, which is staggeringly high compared to the competition, which sold significantly less. But thanks to Nintendo jumping into home console gaming, people actually cared about video games again, which brought about not only more competition, but much better competition than before. Now you actually have to make good games in order to compete, and not just release whatever you can as quickly as you can. So by 1991, Sega already had its Genesis console, Hudson Soft had the TurboGrafx 16, and the SNK Corporation had the Neo Geo. So 1991 was the year where Nintendo answered to the competition with force. And without hesitation, we will be talking about this one very soon. Thank you so much for watching. Leave your suggestions in the comments for future bite-sized documentaries. And until next time.